Good evening to all, and I'm almost an hour late. I apologize. What are we doing tonight? Tonight, we're learning the first part of the second Mayim Basi Ligani Chav Aleph. What we've done is learned these two Maimonim, not in order, but a half at a time. We did one shiur on the first half of the first Maimed, then two shiurim on the first half of the second Maimed, and then last night we did one shiur on the second half of the first Maimed, and today and tomorrow, Bli Neder, we're going to be doing two more shiurim on the second half of the second Maimed, which means if you have this pamphlet, the Anochas Balahak pamphlet, Mamori Basi Ligani Tavshich, it's on page Lametes, where it says, Umamshich Levayer. It's really a review from last night. It's just longer, so I'm dividing each class up into two parts, but it's the same in Yonim. And I guess I imagine that there's going to be people who are not going to want to listen to both, but just going to want to listen to the second, and so on. So I'll do the same review that I did yesterday, but Klaus and Bekitzer. The first half of the Mayim Basi Ligani Tavshich Aleph, both of them, and the second half of the Mayim Basi Ligani Tavshich Aleph seem to be talking about very, very different ideas. The first half seems to be talking about Shemus, Sfiras of Atzilus, which is sublime and pristine and peaceful and insular. The second half of the Mayim Basi Ligani Tavshich Aleph, both of them, seems to be talking about war and combativeness, and conflict and contradiction. So when you look at the two Maimorim and don't learn the two Maimorim, you'll come away thinking that they're talking about apples and oranges. But the truth is that the whole point of the Rebbe is to say that don't let appearances fool you. The first half of Perek Yud Aleph Basi Ligani Tavshin Yud, and the second half of Basi Ligani Perek Yud Aleph Tavshin Yud, even though the first half is talking about Shemus and the second half is talking about Nitzachon and Milchama, they're really the same theme. And what they have in common is the Chibur of Havchan. They're bringing together opposites. The Rebbe actually invokes the words Nimnan and Nois several times. In other words, it's two opposites to the extent that there's no logic to it. You can't explain it. So the first half of the Maimed, he invoked Nimnan and Nois when it comes to Shemus. First of all, Kefimase Ani Nikra, and he explained that when the Eibush comes down to the level of Asiyah, which is the lowest level, the separated level, this was the greatest Gili of Ani, two opposites. Number two, Elav Olei Lebideisav, Midas means Kalim. And Elav means the Elokus of Kalim. And Elokus and Kalim are opposites. And what brings Elokus and Kalim together is Elav Olei Lebideisav Atzmos, like it says in the Alter Rebbe. And number three, that Bezman Azeh, Lei Kifi Shani Nichtav Ani Nikra, the Shem of Havaya is written, and it's pronounced Adnai, because we can't be Megal Shem Havaya, but on Yom Kippur we say it Kiksavi. Why? Not because Yom Kippur is a higher Gilui, but because Yom Kippur is a Chibur of Havchan. That was the first half of the Maimed. We're now going to begin discussing the Milchama, Netzach business. And it's the same thing. Godliness to combat worldliness. To combat what the Rebbe calls Merida, contrariness, opposition, is a Chibur of Havchiyim. And it's the same principle. If you're bringing together opposites, so again, the language that Rebbe used in the first half of this second Maimed is Nimnan Nimnois. I don't know what's going to happen going forward. I don't remember. But the Koyach HaNetzach has to come from Atzmos Hus in order to be able to be engaged in a Milchama. Now, I told you last night in my introduction, and I'm repeating it now in my introduction today, that the Rebbe talks about war in the levels of Eskafia and Eshapcha. Lishlal Shalom Love was Vaz is Eskafia, and Melchames Nitzachon, that your will has to be carried through, is Eshapcha. But what the Rebbe presents is that it's not two different wars. It's two different attitudes towards the same war. A person who engages in a battle, and he has a measure of success or failure, which means he's not going to win exactly 100%. That will always be his kafir. On the other hand, if a person insists that he has to win in every detail, and he has to win absolutely, and he actually succeeds in doing so, that's a Milchama v'Havcha. That's the real concept of Milchamas Nitzachin, as opposed to Milchama Lishlol Sholav Alav is Vaz. So the Rebbe doesn't just see it as two different battles. He sees it as two different attitudes. One attitude is, if I win enough, I'm happy, and the other attitude is, my will has to be carried out. And since my will has to be carried out, if I get 99% of what I want, I have 0 of what I need. I need to have 100%. So now let's begin to read inside with the understanding that both halves of the Maimed, though they're talking about such very different things, Shemitz and Sfiris versus Milchama and Netzach, share this constant that is a chibur of Havchim, which requires the Kiyach of Atzmas, Nimna Nimnois. Let's go to the text. Page Lametes, Siv Zayin Umam Shech Levaye, the Rebbe Rayatz continues explaining. Pem Shech HaPerech, the continuation of this chapter 11. B'negei Elin Netzach, as far as Midas Netzach is concerned, that Kosher Shem Tzvois, which is connected to the Yibish's name Tzvois. Says the Rebbe, She'inyan HaNetzach, Midas HaNetzach is Natua, Mushish Be'etzem HaNefesh V'chulu, is planted in the very deepest levels of the Neshama. The attribute of victory, of aggression, of I have to win at all costs, comes from the very deepest places in the Neshama. And I don't have time to give you a long drasha, but let me just say it this way. We have a Chabad and a Chagas and a Nehi. Chabad is the deepest, Chagas is shallower, and he is even shallower. But it says in Chassidus, and it's also understood in psychology, Chabad is the deepest, but also the most complicated. Nehi is the most shallow, but it's the most visceral, it's the most guttural, it's the most kishkik, most coming from the essence. So when a person engages his Nehi, there's not a lot of sophistication, there's not a lot of thought processes, it's what they call flight or flee, which you have a second for, or instinct or reflex. These things are done by the human being with very, very little premeditation. But they have a force, they have a certitude, they have a black and whiteness about them, which is mamish atzmos. And that's what the Rebbe is trying to say. Midas HaNetzach, when you have to fight a war, the process of fighting a war and the emotion, the determination that's involved in that process is not very sophisticated, but it's incredibly strong because it comes from the very deepest places in the person. And the Rebbe is going to argue that one of the aspects of that strength is will. And will doesn't only mean I'm determined. Will means it has to be my way. And the greater the netzach, the greater the will, the more it has to be my way, until you reach a melech gadol who needs to have milchamas nitzach, and he has to win in every prat. And this is the idea of ishapcha, which I mentioned before. Which explains Gam also that the concept of victory, Yeshne Eitzel Mi, is specifically available to the kind of a human being who's in touch with his etzem hanefesh, with his pintel yid. Who's in touch with his pintel yid? A melech. This is why the previous Rebbe in his Perek explains. Where do you see this attribute of victory? The God where the greatest of people. The Mishu Shafalberach, an ordinary person, or a lowly person. If someone is going to speak against him, he won't win. He's going to back off. He's a coward. And maybe he will defend himself, but he's not going to defend himself with a boldness and with a will. He's going to defend himself with a chutzpah, with a unqualified, an unsufficiently supported chutzpah, which is very different than will, which is very supported. In other words, a simpler person. They're the kinds of things who aim at in which he's going to stand for. There's things that anybody will stand on principle. And the Rebbe says in Yiddish, he stands on principle, but however, other things, he doesn't care that much about, in parenthesis, which is quite different than when someone has the full measure of midas hanetzach. Why? Because if a person has the full measure of midas hanetzach, the criteria is shetzorech lenatzeach kol davar. He has to win in every aspect. And this individual is called cotton, and therefore he doesn't have midas hanetzach b'chol prat. He only has midas hanetzach in certain things, and even in those things where he had midas hanetzach, harei be'efen rak be'efen shianuch az. For the chutzpah, it's not really will; it's just boldness and chutzpah. Doesn't really have the expression of determination. In other words, determination and the will associated with determination is a force, it's a power. It's so forceful, it's so powerful. It can get you to do almost impossible things. It can get other people to do almost impossible things. It's an incredibly powerful force. It's a fact, right? It's an incredibly powerful urge. And the credibility of it exists only in the kind of person who's in touch with his etzem. A person who's not in touch with etzem simply does not have that much access to that will. So there's a very big difference between being determined with will and being chutzpahdik. Chutzpah is bluff. I don't have any force behind I have no authority behind my boldness. I'm just a chutzpahdik. And I'm hoping that you'll not call my bluff and I'll be able to stare you down. The Ratz is will. There's a real power. So the person who doesn't have midas hanetzach, who's bold, is just he's acting chutzpahdik. He's taking a risk. A person who has access to midas hanetzach has a will with such a strength that it can actually do things that are virtually impossible. The previous Rebbe continues further and he says, only the greatest of people has this midah determination. Moreover, the greater one is. His attribute of midas is even greater. And he concludes that the king, specifically a real king, a great king, who's above all of the people, like it says in the pasuk, he's head and shoulders above the people. Of course, this is a pasuk by Shaul HaMelech, and it describes his physiology. Precious. Shaul HaMelech was a giant. He was physically large. He was a head and shoulders above everybody else. Physiologically, it's a fact. And of course, Chassidus explains that as being physically head and shoulders above everybody else was a representation, was a mashal, was a symbol of being metaphysically, beruchni is head and shoulders. So the shoulders, which is the torso, which is the chagas, and specifically Shechem, the back of the shoulder, the back of the chagas, was higher than the people's intelligence. That's how powerful a person he was. And that power is not intellectual. It's personality. It's etzem. Okay, as Chassidus explains, the shoulders of the king, which is part of his torso, part of his chagas, which includes b'chinas acherayim. It's the shechem is the back of the chagas. Says the Rebbe, which is lower than the head. Is also above most people's heads. He's above the head and the mind of most people because he's far greater than they are. And says the Rebbe, a deeper person is a more connected person. A deeper person is a more resolute person. A deeper person is a person with greater opinions and with more of a philosophy of life and with more will that his philosophy should be carried through. The bigger the person, the more you know you're right. And the more you know you're right, the more you have to see to it that your way is carried out. And that's the link. Because he's a bigger person, he's not only more understanding and more sensitive, he's more convinced of his righteousness to the extent that he's head and shoulders above everybody else and has this incredibly powerful midas hanetzach. Such an individual has an incredibly great measure of this attribute of netzach. Betekef with a hardness and tachlis and an absoluteness. So not everybody has midas hanetzach, dafka melech gadol. And the Rebbe continues. The idea of Melchamas Nitzachon is to bring forward his will, his desire, and that he should be victorious. Meaning, when you go into a struggle, you want something. And when you go into a struggle and you want something, there's a concept of hedging your bets. But if you're going into a struggle and the basis for that struggle is your will, if you don't get 100%, you have nothing, so he's determined to get everything. And he explains, there's two kinds of wars, baz. And again, I'm repeating that. The Rebbe says baz and not boz, and I don't know why, which means to plunder and to capture. The second kind of a battle is where my will has to be carried through. It should be according to the will and the desire of this person. And the Rabbi says that this second thing is Iker HaMelchama, is the primary concept of war. Because the first concept of war, it's also war. It's also about victory. But it's not about victory for the sake of victory, it's victory for the sake of the spoils, of the profits, of the reward. The second one is victory for the sake of victory because it's about the will of the king. Or Kfi Shemavai Kvei Kedushin Bodam Tzai Baruch, or the middle that Rebbe discusses this at length. And of course the Rebbe says that in our mind, this is mentioned briefly, Shalish Lo Shalav Alov's Bas, a person who's trying to capture and to plunder. In other words, the basis for the war is material gain. It's measured. How much am I going to gain? How much do I stand to lose? And he determines it by how much strength he has. In addition, it depends on how much is available for him to plunder and to capture. You're not going to go into a big, great battle if you're going to find 10 cents. It has to be worthwhile. Once a person understands the risks and how much it's going to cost, and he also understands how much he stands to gain, he evaluates how worthwhile it is to expend, to give out, to win the war. Because since his concept of victory is measured and there's a measurable reward, his concept of investment in that war also has to be measurable and limited. There's an evaluation based with human intelligence. This kind of a battle, which is always going to be limited, what they call today proportionate strength rather than disproportionate strength. Not just by a king, even by a minister. Even a small minister. As long as you got the resources, you can go ahead. This is even possible in the head and the understanding of the people, which is much lower than the king, that the minds of the people can make the determination that this battle is worth fighting for this reward. It's not necessarily by an individual that's called a melech who's head and shoulders above everybody else. However, there's the other kind of battle. The true concept of victory. Which you find only by kings. It's the second kind of a battle, which is he has to be victorious. The key is his will. It's not what I'm going to get, it's that I'm going to get it. With different words, this idea that some people have such a strong will that every aspect has to be exactly as they wish it. It is primarily by an Adam Gadol, and specifically there's an opposition who's rebelling against him. That when the king encounters opposition, he stands up with the need to be victorious. And what's the nature of the victory? Not that he should defeat this opposition, but his will should be carried out. And since he's focusing not on the enemy but on his will, Indians had this notion that everything should be according to his will. Is primarily, I went just backwards. I'll go back. Since the issue is that his will should be carried out, that his will should be carried through no matter what, says the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says in Yiddish, nothing is going to dissuade him, nothing is going to discourage him because of a calculation of reason. Based on logic and considerations. To the extent, in order to win this war, he dispenses of treasure. All of the treasure that have special properties, special blessing properties, medicinal properties, and so forth. The Hein Yaakov of great wealth and Nesaf in his cabbage that was collected and gathered through previous generations and during his generation over many years. He never uses it. Moreover, not only does he not use it, he doesn't show it to anybody. Nevertheless, when he has to win a war, when the focus on that victory is Milchemes Nitzach and Lasas Kirteinei, he dispenses of all the treasure in a reckless way. This means the way the king would normally treat this treasure is, first of all, he would never use it. He certainly didn't use it reckless. He don't even show it to people. The value of this treasure is enhanced by its lack of availability and access. It's hidden away, like the pasuk says, that secret things you have to look for because they're precious, and part of what makes them precious is that they're unavailable. Under the special circumstances, he was making a wedding for his only son, so he shows the treasure, but he doesn't dispense of it. as eight as he shows the treasure kemavur a dugma biliyuma zela gets brought in Sfarim. How it is in Klipa, Belshazzar was the king after Nebuchadnezzar. Kasher Hoya Teveli when he was in a good mood. Sivil Havis Kli Hamikdash, he brought the vessels of the base Hamikdash Vehera Eisim, he showed them, and of course this cost him his life. But he only showed them on a rare occasion. Aval, even though the king will show them on a rare occasion, Gam Oz Einiv Eifin Shem Vazbim Sa'eitis, he's not dispensing of it, he's showing it off, putting it back away. And when there's a case of war, not only he shows it, but he dispenses of it. Not only he dispenses of it, he disposes of it recklessly. When the king invests in his midah of determination, they will at all costs. And this means that his desire should be carried out. So then, all the precious treasures. Both treasure which collected himself. As well as treasure which has been collected by his ancestors. He doesn't only show them off. He sells them and he dispenses of them in a reckless way, in an underpriced way, because he has to win the war. So a human being has to be very great to have this kind of will. And of course the only person we know that fits this bill is the Rebbe. And the Rebbe's will was steel, it was iron. We know the story has been again to the Chedesh Kislev and the Rebbetzins comments and so on. But the Rebbe's will was iron. And when the Rebbe set a course for himself, his determination was an Eifin Amidas HaNetzach. It wasn't only about the victory, was that his Ratzon should be carried out, which means it has to be B'chol Prat. Rabbi, who the reason for this is, because the whole concept of victory in Natuo, Mushrish, is planted in the Nefesh and the Yetzim and the Nesham. As the Rebbe explains in the Maimer, since victory touches the person at the deepest levels, it'll influence his. He'll throw away his life. Yesterday he kept on using the word Mesaken is chayiv. He risks his life. Here he uses the word Mashlach HaMelech. It's two different Maimorim. Friday night the Rebbe didn't want to say he throws away his life, he just says he wants to risk his life. But here he uses the Lashon Harav that he literally throws his life away. He engages personally in the knot of war, with great sacrifice. And the reason is, since victory touches the level of the neshama and the level of etzem, which is light and above life, which means living in a finite way. The reason the king is prepared to give away his life to win this war, because what he's fighting for is deeper than conscious living. It's his very, very, very etzem. And he continues, just like we understand by a human king. There's a concept of a battle, of a war, that's fought with some kind of a measure. And there's a concept of a battle or a war which is fought with zero measure. The same is true in Elokus. And again, I want to remind you that when it comes to Elokus, you're dealing with the greatest chibur of Havchim, Nesach Kamsum Atzmos Mahus, Ein Sov Baruch, when it comes down into a war zone, into a Muhammad with a Menagid. And again, I told you earlier, that the way it is by people is because since it's a superficial midah, in its simplicity it has a hardness and a toughness which comes from etzem. The same is true in the midas hanetzach, and the same is true in midas netzach when it comes to Elokus. There's the idea of Hashem's holy name Tzvais, as it is L'mayla, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, when I fight with evil people, I'm called Tzvais. Miloshen Sav, which means an army. For this reason, the reason the Jewish people have to be like soldiers is because the Eibishter is like a soldier in his war with his opposition. In other words, he harnesses midas hanetzach. That's why it's called Tzivis Hashem. And the Rebbe goes into again this idea that there's three levels. There's Tzivis Havaya, there's Havaya Tzvais, and in between those two, there's Tzvais itself. Tzivis Havaya is in Atzilus, where there's no fight, where the fight is totally over. Havaya Tzvais is the fight itself, as the fight is ongoing, and Tzvais is someplace in the middle. And he explains, and I explained this to you yesterday the way I understood it. Although I may be making a mistake, but Shkiyas mi Yavin. The Tzemach explains. Only after Moshe Rabbeinu passes away. That during Moshe's lifetime, Yidden were called Tzivos Hashem. Nevertheless, even though during Moshe Rabbeinu's lifetime Yidden were called Tzivos Hashem, The idea of tzava did not exist. When Yeshua ben Nun becomes the leader, the pasuk says, "Ani sar tzva havaya." I am the general of the Eibishter's armies. Ata Basi, I have come now. Then a malach came to join Yeshua in his battle against the Yericha and against the Goyim in Etzisrael. And with Moshe Rabbeinu there was no malach. Why? Because Moshe Rabbeinu drew from the Eibishter himself, or said slightly differently, Moshe Rabbeinu was his own malach, and he wouldn't hear of it. He wasn't interested in an angel. He wasn't interested in an intermediary. He wanted the Eibishter to personally engage in their lives and to fight their battle, because he wanted to be in a madrege, which is really above a battle altogether. And the Medrash explains these words, now I have come. Ata Basi, now I have come. I came to your Rebbe Moshe, and he kicked me out. He davened and he said, if the Eibush is not going to lead us personally, Al Ta'aleinu B'zeh is not moving. But Moshe refused the malach. But when Yeshua becomes the Nasi, he does embrace this malach, who's the general who's going to assist him in battle. This creates a Yiddishkeit which is connected to Shem Tzvos and Biyah. Once the Eibush's relationship with the Yidden was through the medium of a malach, which is some kind of a Medida Agbala and Tzimtzum, Avodas Hashem has the name of the Eibush, which is also Tzvos, Havaya Tzvos. So long as Moshe says, no, there's no malach, the Eibush himself is going to govern us. So his involvement in a Milchama would have been in a way that he's removed from his enemy to such an extent that there really wouldn't be a battle in the first place. But Yeshua is on a lower level, and he accepts the support of a malach. In other words, he accepts the idea that there's going to be Milchama because there's Liyumaz. And because there's Milchama, because there's Liyumaz, then you go into the question of what extent one is engaging in this battle. Hachel beginning Michana. The first of the Revi'im to mention Shein Tzvos is Chana. Shepas Chotilo Lukas Lakadosh Baruch Havayit Tzvos. She was the first to call the Eibishter Hashem Tzvos, not Tzivis Hashem, but Hashem Tzvos. And the Chein HaNevi'im Acharim Shel Achared, this would continue in the later prophets. She was saved by his Rishon and Tchilas Managos, especially the last Nevi'im, and the end of Beis HaMikdash Rishon, and the beginning of Golus. Because the Nimshach Ad Chlos Managos Ad Lachas has been continuing ever since, and the Rebbe seems to be implying that all Nevi'im nowadays have a Shachas with Hashem Tzvos, with Tzadok and Gadol. And the best example is Nevuah Zechariah. Shekemat Kol HaNevuah Tzeh B'Shem Havayit Tzvos. Almost all of Zechariah's, Nevi'as, and have the Shem Havayit Tzvos. The end has to be Shia Leirak Havayit Tzvos. Like I mean the Tivus Havayit. You start off as Havayit Tzvos, which means Havayit comes down to the Madrega of Tzvos to fight and engage with Klippa. On a Madrega, the Klippa is Tefes Makam. And the lowest level, the battle is not going to be a Milchamas Nitzach. It's going to be a Milcham of Lish Lo Shalom Basi. You're going to settle for partial victory and partial loss. And then you're going to be raised to a higher Madrega of Shem Tzvos itself, where you're going to have to win completely. It's Hapcha. And after one has to win completely, then he has Madrega of Tivus Havai, who will battle to the Eibush. That's how it's explained. Elish Indians are now said they're going to Havaydak Shurim Havai Tzvos. First you start on a level where you engage in the lower worlds. And you're fighting with the lower worlds, and the force and the power you're engaging is finite, and therefore the victory is also measurable. That's a skafia. Then you go to his hapcha, and then the highest madrege, which is even above this hapcha, is sivis havai. The Rebbe explains in Tivus Hashem and Lashon Samach, when you have the word Tivus next to the word Havai, the Tivus is close to Havai. In other words, Tivus nitbel Hashem Havai. Excuse me for 1 second. Baruch, I didn't know anybody. That there's Shem Tzvos, which is bottled to Shem Havai. That's Tivus Hashem, the higher level. There is no entity by itself, Mulvad and Yandavai, besides for the Eibush Shem Havai. Even true Tafel bottle Lagamir Havai, it's totally nullified next to Shem Havai, which is Tzaval Havai. So Tivus Havai means that there's a concept of a war and a concept of an army, but they're close to Havai, and in their closeness to Havai, their identity as an army, and their identity as warriors is nil. Because next to Havai, there's no world, there's no opposition, there's no good nothing. And when you learn the Maimer, it's mashma. This is not only not iskafi, it's even higher than ishapchet. There's chatchila garnish. However, lamata means that there's lower levels, and that's the level of Hashem Tzvos. Shashem zed that the name Hashem Tzvos might shows alamayim do matzav that nicham rashayim in a condition where there's actually a war between the Eibusher and the Shayim. Hainu, in other words, yesh nemitzi as from an there's an opposition. You got to fight with him. And when you fight, You're not going to obliterate him and pulverize him to the extent that he doesn't exist. You're going to deal with him in a measurable. Says the Rebbe, the difference between Tzivas Hashem and Hashem Tzvois, when we are contained, when we are bound by the limitations of Elam is Bri, Yitzid, Nasi, Chametzias, and Yesh. And the Lakus has to engage in a war with those worlds. He has to engage in a war with those worlds as those worlds can take it in a finite way. Turn the page. Shesham, that in those lower worlds, Yesh, there's all kind of limitations. And therefore the Gilia Lakus is not going to overwhelm the Klippa altogether. It's just going to subdue it to some extent. The same is true in a person's service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu Sheyesh Namal upon him. There is at the very least Hamitzadim the Gedusha, it's holiness, but it's limitation, which is Mitzadim Magvulam Shel HaSeichel, the human mind, which also is interested in understanding the Lakus, is limited. Shemitzad Zed, when a person serves Hashem using his finite human mind, Ha'aved Hi Be'ef, and the way he fights the battle, She'ef Shel Lov L'Bit Lamiti, he'll never come to true battle. Because Gambi Yeseh V'Darga Yeseh, now from the highest levels of Abba V'Yid, it's still Yesh Misha'ir. This means Shigambi Yeseh V'Darga is a bitl Del Mabri, even when it's level of the world of Bria. Harei Odai Mitzvah still has a form, and even more a Yesh. L'chol HaPochas Kam Mitzvah Del Mabri, at least at the form of Del Mabri V'Kiv, and Sheyesh Nincham Mitzvah, since even in Bidjas and Mitzvahs, the war between Kedusha and Klippa in Bria is not in a way that the Klippa is nothing, but that the Klippa is formidable, and you fight in a level where you win some, you lose some, so to speak. This is the beginning. Bria is the beginning of another, of Klippa. The beginning of a war with Klippa. And when you're in the beginning of the war, you're fighting the war in a way where you're trying to do your best. What can I accomplish? This is what you commit to, and what you can't accomplish, you don't commit to. It's all b'medida v'agbal. However, there's also the idea that Elokus and Sfiris are one. Even in Bria, there's a trace of the idea of in the sense of the God that's in the lower worlds. You have the idea when you're Hashem Tzvos. You're able to fight a war with the Nishayim, and he says Paltiel said you can effect a victory, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ezer, the Eibishter helps, which is what the words Hashem Tzvos mean. Hashem comes down to support Tzvos. The way the Rebbe said in the previous moment that Yehudi law joins with Yehudi Tato. One is able to be victorious in war. And then one graduates from Havayit Tzvos to Tzvos Stab, which is Oisu B'Tov. Oisu B'Tov means we're talking about the Eibishter, who's outstanding in the lower worlds. Oisu B'Tov, the Eibishter is outstanding in the lower worlds, is B'li Mulchama. And this is really, like I said to you yesterday, it's ironic that there's several other Basi Liganis. When he talks about Shem Tzvos, he only mentions the middle word, Oisu B'Tov. And in this time, he almost avoids the discussion of the middle one. He talks about the higher one, Sivis Hashem, and the lower one, Hashem Tzvos. But here he mentions that after this kafir, which is Hashem Tzvos, comes this hapcha, which is Tzvos by itself. There's three levels. There's Havayit Tzvos, there's Tzvos, and there's Tzivis Havayit. The Rebbe just spoke about Tzvos by itself, and he says that Tzvos by itself is kafir, is hapcha, defeating the Klippa completely. But being called Tzvos by itself, where you're defeating the Klippa completely, does not make it Kedusha yet. One is not entering onto itself. So, when your person fights the war on a level where he's going to win it, so he's defeating the Klippa because of the fight that he's having. But that doesn't mean that he's Sivis Havaya, but Havaya, it simply means that his Menaged has been defeated. He's not entity unto himself, it's second, which is Tzva Lahavaya. So, let's be clear. When you fight a battle on the level of Iskafia, you win Lemech to L'Shlish L'Leviyah. When you fight a battle of Ishapcha, you're going to win 100%. But winning 100% doesn't mean there's no fight. And by the virtue of the fact that you have to fight and win, so Taka, the winning, is complete, but Havaya, Tzivas Hashem, it's not. Tzivas Hashem means there's such a great presence of Havaya next to the soldier that there's no possibility for war. You don't have that in Tzvos by itself. So Havaya Tzvos would be when you're fighting a battle on a limited level, and Tzva is kafia, and Tzva is to be the infinite hapcha, and Tzivas Hashem is even higher than that. You're winning the war. But it's not that you become one thing with Shem Havaya. Well, the Ma'alim is at the highest level is the way with Moshe Rabbeinu, and of course Moshe Rabbeinu didn't fight; he avoided it. So Moshe Rabbeinu raised up his generations of the Madrega of Tzivas Hashem, not because he raised them up the in from Muhammad after he passed away, Muhammad returned, but he raised them above it. And La'asad Lavi, there's going to be again Tzivas Havaya, but that Tzivas Havaya is going to be after this Hapcha, and then there's going to be no more Klipa altogether. It's not like Moshe Rabbeinu's time to the pasuk says and he swore so Havaya ata Basi that koyachol the Malach is coming to help Yeshua ben. Which is the source of the Eibishter's name, which is mislabish in the lower worlds to fight the war at least on the level of his kafiyim. So Moshe Rabbeinu is above it, is above the iskafia and even above the ishapch, bittul to Havaya, but Yeshua isn't. Well, in Yom, the reason for this is the Pnei Moshe Kipnei Chama. The Gemara says the face of Moshe Rabbeinu is like the sun. Mashen Kipnei Yeshua Kipnei Levana. The face of the Yeshua is like the moon. Says the Rebbe, what does this mean in Avodah? The sun has no changes. The sun never goes through fluxes. The reason the sun goes through no fluxes is the sun is even this hapcha, and in this hapcha there's no more klipa. There's no klipa. There's no need for shinuyim. There's opposition whatsoever. One serves Hashem without any changes whatsoever. Until one reaches the madrega of tzivas Hashem. In other words, one's form is no longer self-contained. It's all together included in Shem Havaya, which is Eif and Havaya, which is Shem Atzilus B'klal, Shem Havaya, which is Nelam Atzilus. So, when a person fights on the level of his hapch, and he's zoicha that the Eibush is magal to him the Havaya, which is close to Tzvais, then he's holding with the leg of Tzivas Hashem. Says the Rebbe, away from Aved, the Shemitah Elam Atzilus, that's what it is in Atzilus. Because Shem Havaya Tzivas Hashem and Yanish Elam Atzilus Havaya is Hashem Atzilus. The same is true of Moshe Rabbeinu, that his Inyan is Atzilus. Even down here in this world, he was a madrega of Atzilus, like it says in many places. Even when he was involved in the lowest klipas, he was he was involved in B'chaltarai, he was involved in Gashmias, and everything was a yichud. The same is true of Moshe Rabbeinu. The world did not disturb him. So Moshe is much higher than Yeshua. Yeshua is affected by the world. That's such Kibin Nirvana, there's his fluxes. I'm sorry. Moshe serves the Eibush on a level which is so strong that there's no shinuyim, because the klipa is nisbatel legamre. Says the Rebbe, v'zehu inyan Moshe l'psik time b'gavai, that between the two words Moshe Rabbeinu, there's no interruption. You see, there's many, this is in Samach Vav and Usfartem, that there's a number of people whose names are repeated twice in the Chumash. Avram, Noach, Yankov, and of course Moshe, and Havaya. So by all the others, there's a psik time. Between the two Avrams, there's a psik. Between the two Yankovs, there's a psik. Between the two Noachs, there's a psik. Because there's one in Atzilus among the lower worlds, and they're very different, like it says in the Ger Tekei, the Shemitah Zvav in the beginning. But because Moshe is higher than Atzilus, so the two Moshes are not Atzilus and Bria, but Ein Seif and Atzilus. And when you're talking about Ein Seif and Atzilus, Leip Psik Time and Begavai, there's no separation, because Atzilus is Gili Helam. It's Mein Amoyer. So Moshe Rabbeinu's Madrege is such that Leipzig time of Bagavaya means that even down here he's a Gili of Atzilus because he was higher than Atzilus. Mashenkin Yeshu. And then the Rebbe breaks down further with Prati, Gimel in Yonam Sofa, we talked about two things, Tzivas Hashem and Hashem Tzvais, but you should know there's really a third, the middle Madrege, which is Eisu B'Tzava Delay. Inyan Tzivas Havaya, the idea of the army of Hashem as was called, names of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is Eifan Havaya B'Elam Atzilus, is Tafel Batal Havaya. There's no Muhammad. There's just not this is hapcha. There's nobody to be mahapach. There's only godliness. On the other, in Havaya Tzvais, we have Havaya Tafel Tashem Tzvais, which is Eif and Havaya B'Elam Atzilus coming to the lower world. So Yesham Yeshna Mitzias from Menagad. There is opposition. It's all you have to fight with him. Will naschen to defeat him. And even when you defeat him, he's still there because you defeated him only by bending him, which is his kafi. In the between level is Tzvais, that the Eibush stands out in his armies, means in the lower worlds. And look at these Lashenas. The concept of Shem Tzvais, which of course is brought in Teir Eden Pashas Bey, and then in the middle of Rebbe, and it's a Machzedek, that this is a Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe, which is not saying Kisvei Arizal. That there's even in Bri Yitzir and Asiya, that also in Ilmus Bad there's Gamei Echad K'mei Shehu Be'elam Atzilus as it is in Atzilus. And this is like the Gili of Yechudei Law in Yechudei Tata, parenthesis. It's explained in other places in footnote 98 in Saint Eitz Chayim. There's a concept to bring the higher Yichud into the lower Yichud. Then the ones work on level of Yichud. That's also the way it's supposed to be. That the inyan of tzvais, not havaya tzvais, but tzvais by itself, is that you come into the lower worlds and you reveal atzilus into the lower worlds. However, the Kabbalah we said before, the highest level is not tzvais, it's not only this hapche, but that there's no menagid altogether, which is the madrega of tzivus Hashem, which is eifan over to that atzilus. So you have 3 steps. The first step is havaya tzvais. The second step is tzvais by itself, and the third step is tzivus Hashem. But Moshe Rabbeinu is before all of them. And if it's 3 steps, and the last step is Tivus Hashem, how is Moshe Rabbeinu Zechet Tivus Hashem? Of course, the answer to the question of Pasha says, I don't know. And if you have to guess the vart, is Moshe decided to raise the Yidden above the Mulchama. He raised them to a madreg where there would be no klipa to disturb them, and that's why they were called Tivus Havaya. And they were in a sinas koyach that later on we should not only fight, but we should win and we should transform and revisit the madreg of Tivus Hashem. V'adayin tzarech yin gor. As we said before, to the end of Avodas Hashem is Hashem, which is the Avodah in Atzilus. In order to reach this, you have first have Akdamas Avodah Debiyah, which is the Melchama, and you have to win it, which is the Skafia, which is the Madrega of Havaya Tzvais, and then you have Ina Mamutza, which is Bein Eifen Avodah Detzilus, Eifen Avodah, which is Avodah of his Hapcha. That in Biyah there should be Atzilus. In other words, Havaya Tzvais is Yechudei Tata, means after the war the enemy still exists. Tzvais by itself is Yechudei Law in Yechudei Tata, that the enemy has been transformed. But the Madrega, your definition, is the transformation of your enemy. And Tivus Hashem means there's nothing besides for HaKadosh Baruch. So today we learned what? That the second half of this Maimer is going to discuss that Tzvais is Moshe Shenatzmos. And this is expressed especially in a great king who is fighting a war on a level of Midas and Nitzachim, not Lishlol Sholo, V'lov was Baz. And that even though in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu the inyan of Tzivus Havaya was above the Mulchama, later on we went down into the Mulchama, both on the level of Havaya Tzvais and on the level of Tzvais itself, until we reached the Madrega of Tzivus Hashem, which is going to be the Yosef Love. And Rabbi continues in Peirik Tes and he says, we just established that there's a war. And that the war has a first step, which is a skafia, a second step, which is a hapcha, and a third step, which is tafel about l'shem avaya. Says the Rebbe, to fight the enemy and defeat him. And the beginning is tchila, beifin shel skafia. First you have to bend him, which is avaya tzvais. Beifin shel hapcha, which is the idea of tzivus Hashem, which is the idea of bizbas ha'etzis. But this means to say kvish mavayir kvei kedush and marash as Reb Marash has. Be'inyan midas hanetzach as far as the netzach is concerned. She'enyon, the concept of midas hanetzach is levatel samenagit, to make a bittul in the opposition. There should be no more opposition left. Any move in the shalza posheter. Eich shayech leimer. How could you say? This is a simple common sense question. Sheyesh inyan shal menagit lagabi lamaylech has to show that the Eibush has opponents. The who can possibly stand up to the Eibush that the Eibush would have to defeat him? You're talking about God. And Mavayr and Tzemachtarek answers, this need for war and victory is Netzach Yisrael, the Jewish determination. Because in that position, the Eibush has that position. And therefore, there are those who oppose the Jewish people. They oppose the Eibishter himself, right? Like it says, Melchemes Hashem b'midman, Melchemes Yisrael b'midman. If you oppose the Jewish people, you oppose HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's why the Eibishter employs Midas HaNetzach for our sake. On this concept of the battle, that Yidden are fighting the one level of Midas HaNetzach, on the level of his kaf, is hapcha. We're destroying the klipa completely. The pasuk says, "Netzach Yisrael shakav le'inacham." The eternity of the Jew doesn't lie and doesn't regret. Kilei Adam Hu Lihinachim. It's not human. Human beings you can negotiate with, you can reconsider, you can reevaluate, but Lo Adam not. Should be just an etzech and Shachas Mechinas Kilei Adam Hu the me just an etzech from the Reg of Lo Adam, which is Lamayel Mechinas Adam Shalakis. And therefore, the concept of this victory is to make no considerations. And he's going back again to the Inyan of Mechamas Nitzachim, which he spoke about in the beginning of today's Shir. And the king has to win, and he has to win in every detail. And he's even going to throw his life away. And therefore, one of the things that's accomplished or achieved or is done is Mevaz, all things are dispensed recklessly. He puts his life at risk. And here it doesn't say like he said a few pages before. He says Sakana. The power of this will to fight and win all at all costs come from the Madrega of Lei Adam, which is higher than Atzil. It's higher. Turn to page Mem Daled now. Mikol Achashvein, small calculations, Vanyanim and things, which justifies hiding the treasure. Not to show them, and certainly not to dispose of them and dispense of them. And nevertheless, when you have a Muhammad, they're dispensed of. Because we're dealing with what? With bringing a Lakus of Atzilus into the lower world, so have a full Nitzach. And the Rebbe continues to explain what the Frierdiker Rebbe says. And of course, what we're about to read, I already said. There's two levels of Avodah. The first is called Iskafia, and the second is called Ishapcha. Iskafia means to bend, and Ishapcha means to transform. Inyan Iskafia, the opponent still exists. You win him on the battlefield, but winning on the battlefield is not unconditional surrender necessarily, and winning on the battlefield is not total annihilation. It's winning on the battlefield. And of course, it's idea that Shekadosh Baruch Hu is able to help with the Shem Tzvot Shem Muhammad. And I wrote on the margin of my own sefer, this is a Vayetz face. That's the Iskafia. Even when you have Iskafia, there's also Bizbaz HaEtzes. Like it says in Chazal, the only thing the Eibishter owns is the treasure of Yireh Shamayim. I wish I had time to analyze this. I'm not sure I know what it means, but I would like to study the word Oitzer and Yireh Shamayim. Oitzer means a treasure. It's an atzmiistic thing that the Eibishter owns in this world, that there are some people who've achieved the Madrega of Yiras Hashem. Shedem, as the Pasuk says, that the Eibishter makes it easy on us. All we have to do is fear Him. So all we have to do is fear HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Eibishter helps us fear Him. However, even when we have this treasure, and we fight this war, and we win this war, it's still a Iskafia. And the Pasuk says, the Eibishter says to the person, this Pasuk in Eiv, it is true that fear of God is Chachma. In other words, the connection between Yira and Yira Be'elah, which is Primus HaYira and Yira Elah. And the Rebbe says, even Yira Elah, even this Eitzash Yira Shamayim, which the Eibishter disposes of, is still not B'li Cheshbon, it's still not to the degree of Mashal Chayiv Mineged, it still has the consideration, because you're only trying to do Iskafia. And he continues on, however, so in other words, the Rebbe is saying that you have Bizbuz or Eitzes by both, which is not so clear in the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimer. It's just the quality of the Bizbuz. Bizbuz or Eitzes, by his Hapche is on HaCheshbon L'gamre. However, this Iskafia Bilvad, when one's involvement with Klipa is Iskafia. It's not the highest Madrega, even though the Eibishter gives you the Eitzes to fight and defeat the Klipa, it's not the highest levels. You have the idea of transformation. And this Hapcha means that once this Hapcha is done, there's no opposition, and the highest Madrega, that is Tzivas Havai. Now again, there's something unclear about the language, but it seems quite clear that the way to say it correctly is that what makes the Menagid disappear is Tzivas by itself, Tzvais by itself. And after the Menagid disappears altogether, then you have Tzivas Havaya, which reveals the Dveikus of the whole creation, including the army to the Eibishter. Shein Shum Mitzias, there's no secondary existence of Lakel Tafel Havaya. There's two steps. The first step is Iskafia, Havaya Tzvois. The second step is Ishapchet Tzvois. And the third step is that even the Mahapach is also bottle, Tzivas Hashem. Okavish Mavayr, as he explained, Teogam Klaus Achil, Kafil Bavid, Medegas Aben, Medegas Atzadik. Iskafia is Medegas Abenani, and Ishapcha is Medegas Atzadik. Because Abed is Aben, Bevin Shal Iskafia, but Aben has to bend Klipa. Like it doesn't he's fighting his war the whole life. He's never going to win it because the Klippa still exists inside of him. So even though he's fighting and he's winning, but the fighting and there's a bizbas ha'etzes, it's all in the madrega of beinanim. Mashen can avoid a tzaddik as opposed to a tzaddik. Sheklar ovad v'gamar legam. He's altogether finished aveda milchami mara. He's done with his battle with evil altogether, which is why he's no longer called Eved Avayel Eved Hashem. And this is hapcha. This lashon Eved Hashem lashon Ovad from good kleren. Because Eved Hashem lashon, it's not Eved Hashem lashon Ovad. It's Eved Hashem lashon Hashem Atayir. Aye. Okay, let's leave it alone. And the Rebbe finishes. We're going to learn one more paragraph, and the rest of it we're going to finish tomorrow. What we have is a concept of war. What we have is a concept of bizbaz ha'etzes. What we have is a concept of netzach. The highest kind of war with the maximum kind of netzach has the maximum kind of bizbaz ha'etzes. And this is his hapcha. A lesser war has a lesser bizbaz ha'etzes and a lesser victory, and this is his kafi. And he connects it to a pasuk, which is part of the Rebbe's Drusha Chassid. The Frierdiker Rebbe said, "This is my morning," by the Rebbe's Chassid. Says the Rebbe, "V'zeh ogam b'yizayin yarim shebapasuk tzidkas pirzein Yisrael." And the Gemara translates what's the meaning of pirzein. It's Hakadosh Baruch Hu shebisun l'minut. It's almost the same. Tzidkas pirzein is the reish before the zayin. Tzaka also Hakadosh Baruch Hu shal shepizron l'bein u'misrael. The zayin is before the reish. What's the difference? Pizran, Hashem scatters amongst the nations to deal with it. Pirzan means that we live prostate, we live in open fortified cities, we don't need to protect each other because everyone is very safe. So prozes is the ultimate schar. Pizran is the ultimate galus. And the pasuk says one word and means a different thing. The pasuk says tzitkas pirzayne, and the Gemara says has to be pizrayne. So the Frierdiker Rebbe asked the kasha, if it meant pizrayne, why did it say pirzayne? And the Rebbe answers because the end is going to be prozes. So in the beginning of the Avodah, we already say tzitkas pizrayna in anticipation of the process which is going to be the Yosef Lavi. These two ideas of pizrayna, that the Yidden are scattered all over the world and you have to worry about them. And the idea of process, that Yidden are going to live in the greatest and most comfortable and independent way, are connected. The pshat is that haderech lavi, the way a Yid ultimately reaches the madrega of pirzayna, after Mashiach comes, we live in our own estates, separate from other people, without a concern that we're going to be attacked. It's the requirement for this is pizron. He sent us into Golos, and this sets up the ultimate process. In other words, it's kafia, which brings the Yeshapch. When he brings the Gemara, the pizur, the Yisrael ben Umas is commandment as Alagol, the Yisrael ben Umas Elam, Ella, Kadesh, taste for them, Gadim. The reason for Gol is for Gadim. And of course, it doesn't mean physical converts, because historically they have not been that many. It means sparks. Pirush Bazach Sidus explains. It doesn't mean literally converts. Because you cannot justify what Yidden have been through for the few Gadim that have been collected. The sparks of holiness which are infinite, virtually. They're foreigners, they're hidden in physical things. Jews are exiled, like it says in the Chazal. However, when a Yid is involved in worldly things for the sake of his parnasa. So gam tzlacha bagash moving his physical needs, ubeshtamish behem lekadusha uses them for holiness minyan achila. For example, eating. That's not stam pas like say to achila, but that's the energy that he got to the food he's going to daven and learn. Azai, so then mates he extracts. It's a nitzus kedusha, the spark of holiness. Mitachas mamshal sasar shalisam medina, from under the dominance of the minister of that medina. Umagaide, and he converts the spark. Umalei raises back up the church of his root. So the madrega of the shtaba v'guf of the malch, which is an incredibly high level in Atzilus, very deep level in Atzilus. But the purpose is the birudim which happen in Golos in a way of Iskafi, which brings to Ishapach. And he concludes, I days the barlin the pirzain in Russian presentation Sham Shameda Mamad the Matha Shein Sicham Chema Hamagin of the Avim Menagid Kivish is battle come to him, which is Ishapach. The also the love of Yid not going to live spread out. And there's not going to be anybody carrying a gun or having a problem with militia, because there's going to be no opposition whatsoever. That's the complete ishapach. The Cholzen Nasa, the Inyan HaMelchama, this requires a war and a way of bizbaz ha'etzes. And what kind of bizbaz? Not the bizbaz with the cheshbon, but bizbaz b'lishum ta'am b'cheshbon, which is above mitzvah magvum l'kedusha. This is how you defeat the Melchama. Okay, I may have rattled off a little bit at the end, but what I did tonight was learn half of what we learned last night. We learned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 amudim. Last night we learned 7, but these 6 amudim encompass half of what was discussed last night, and hopefully tomorrow we'll finish. Good night, good morning, good afternoon.